Welcome, welcome, welcome to another digital lesson where we're going to be looking at the attempts made to save the Union. So before the country collapses into a bloody civil war, what attempts were made to save the Union? And the first thing to know before we understand what was done is this term compromise. And compromise is a middle way between two extremes. And in the United States, in the lead up to the Civil War, we obviously had two very big extremes. On the one hand, you had the American South, an area that was a proponent and an advocate for slavery. And then you had the American North, who, as time were to go on, more and more of the North became very much staunch abolitionists, people that thought that slavery was morally and religiously wrong. And so, as these two sides get further and further apart on the issue of slavery, this idea of compromise is used to kind of keep things together. And the first instance where we see compromise used is the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And what you really need to understand is, at the time of the Missouri Compromise, you had an even number of free soil states and an even number of slave soil states. Now, you're probably wondering, why does that matter? The number of states, whether they were free or slave, what's the big deal? Well, whichever side had more. So if there were more free states than slave states, the free states had the ability to control Congress and pass laws getting rid of slavery. If the slave states had more members in Congress than the free soil states, then they could do the same thing, but in favor of slavery. They could expand slavery. And so this idea of compromise is to try and eliminate the effects of one group over the other. And so the first compromise in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, we have Missouri entering the Union as a slave state. To make sure that it doesn't upset the balance of the slave states and the free states, Massachusetts gives up part of its land and it joins the Union as a free state in 1820. Now, if you recall from our colonial unit, Massachusetts used to control this territory up here, but they let it become its own separate state from Massachusetts so that there would still be an even number of slave states and free states. Then you have this 36 degree 30 minute line, the Missouri Compromise line. It's the southern border of Missouri. And this line becomes the dividing line between free territory north of the line and slave territory south of the line. So in 1820, there is to be no new slavery in the United States north of the 36 degree 30 line. So 3630 becomes the line that separates slave territory from free territory. And then if you notice in the west here, we've got Spanish Mexico. So to the west of the Arkansas Territory and the west of Louisiana, this is Spanish Mexico. So it belongs to Spain. Now, over the course of the next 30 years, that is going to change. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But first, you need to get your quick notes. Also, before we dive into that, I want you to notice here where it says North Carolina and South Carolina. This is the vote for the senators for or against the Missouri Compromise. This compromise passed barely. And the reason it passed is one senator from North Carolina and one senator from South Carolina voted for it. Most every slave state voted against this compromise because it limited the expansion of slavery going forward. So the Missouri Compromise, Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, and Maine enters the Union as a free state. The next compromise we'll look at is the Compromise of 1850. But before we dive into that compromise, you need to understand some of the issues that were going on 30 years after the Missouri Compromise. The first issue between the North and South: should California be allowed to enter the Union as a free state? Following the gold rush, scores of people flocked to California in the late 1840s. And with a whole bunch of people in California, they want to become a state. So the state had not allowed slavery because they wanted their miners to still have jobs and they didn't want their jobs being replaced by slaves. So they wanted to enter the Union as a free state. But if California enters the Union as a free state, it would upset the balance of slave states and free states. And then you have the issue of the Southwest Territory. The United States had won a war with Mexico. And when the United States won a war with Mexico, they got a bunch of land from Mexico. So the question becomes, should we allow slavery in the Southwest Territory? Should those territories be declared free? Or should we allow the people that lived there, the inhabitants, to choose for themselves? Meaning the settlers in those territories get to make their own decisions about slavery. Now, the Northerners oppose this idea because they're worried about it upsetting the balance of Congress between slave states and free states. Again, we're talking about this balance between the slave states and the free states. And then finally, should slavery be illegal in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital? From the start of from the founding of Washington, D.C., slavery had been allowed in the capital. Of course, Washington, D.C. was surrounded by Virginia and Maryland, both slave states, so it made sense from that perspective. But the northern representatives in D.C. did not want slavery in the capital. So the Compromise of 1850 does 5 things. The first thing it does is California is admitted as a free state. All right, so California enters the United States as a free state. The next thing it does is it takes Utah and New Mexico Territory, the 2 territories in the Southwest, and it says that they will allow popular sovereignty. They will allow the people of those states to decide if they want to be free or slave states. So they use popular sovereignty there in the Southwest. Then they pass a much more stringent fugitive slave law. Folks, these 2 things, well, California entering the U.S. as a free state, that's very much beneficial to the North. Well, this is a compromise. They have to do something to help the southern states out. Otherwise, the South isn't going to vote for this. And so they pass a very difficult fugitive slave law. This fugitive slave law allows southern plantation owners, people that own slaves, to go to the North and arrest escaped slaves and bring them back south. So here you have a fugitive slave's attention. The slave hunter is among us. Be on your guard and arrest is planned for tonight. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. Folks, this is a warning to the slaves. Be ready to receive them whenever they come. They're telling the slaves, get ready. Somebody's coming. Be ready to fight. Then you have this one, caution colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and police officers of Boston. Law enforcement officers had to follow the laws of returning escaped slaves. That's what the fugitive slave law said. Well, northern people, abolitionists, hated these laws. And if someone was caught helping a fugitive slave escape, they could be fined or imprisoned. So these were very harsh fugitive slave laws in the sense that anybody helping these slaves, these escaped slaves, they could be thrown in jail, they could be fined. This wasn't good at all if you were a northerner who didn't like slavery. So a new tougher fugitive slave law is passed. The fourth thing, Washington, D.C., they decide that the slave trade is not allowed in D.C. Slavery is still allowed in D.C., but you can no longer buy or sell slaves in the nation's capital. And the final and arguably the most important thing that the Compromise of 1850 does is it upsets the balance of slave states and free states. If you notice over here, there are 16 free states in the United States in 1850 and only 15 slave states. So the free states have more states than the slave states by 1. And that upsets the balance in Congress. So you've got an upset slave states and free states with balance in Congress coming into play. The final compromise is the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act has everything to do with a cross-country railroad. And you're probably wondering, why in the world does this have anything to do with a cross-country railroad? Well, with California joining the Union, California is the only state west of Texas. And California needs a railroad connecting it to the rest of the country. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois wants to link Chicago, a major city in his home state, with California. And he wants there to be a railroad running from Chicago to California. Well, to get that railroad running from Illinois to California, he has to have the support of the southern states, because the southern states obviously want a railroad running through the south. And the United States had made the Gadsden Purchase down here in New Mexico territory to do just that in 1853. So to get support from the south, Stephen Douglas has this idea that we'll let the folks in Nebraska and Kansas decide if they want slavery or not. We'll let popular sovereignty determine. Again, popular sovereignty is the people of that state get to choose whether or not they want slavery. We'll let that determine if these states want slavery or if they want to be free. And because this throws away the Missouri Compromise from 1820, the southern states go for it. So this line dividing the free states from the slave states is no longer valid. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, people in each state would get to decide if they wanted slavery or not. And this, again, was known as popular sovereignty. And folks, this idea does not go well in Kansas. Violence erupts. You have very passionate abolitionists that are against slavery living right alongside people with slaves. Fighting erupts early, and it gets very, very violent. People die. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, and we'll talk about that in our next episode when we look at some of the consequences of all of these things taking place and what happens next to send the country further down to war.